Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 36 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Edmonton Oilers, in which the Sharks have lost 5-0. And this was a bit of a weird game for San Jose. Just looking on the surface of this one, you see a 5-0 loss, and you're thinking, well, clearly the Edmonton Oilers just dominated the Sharks here tonight, skated circles around them, and this was never actually a close game at all. And some of those things are definitely partially true, but when you look a bit deeper into this one, it definitely didn't feel entirely that way. The first period was one where the Sharks clearly didn't show up to play particularly well. They were not ready for this one, and the Oilers, with their speed, abused the San Jose Sharks with multiple different mistakes coming from multiple different Sharks players. But past that first period, the Sharks, whether this is because the Oilers kind of sat back a bit, or maybe it was the Sharks waking up a bit, or perhaps a combination of both, but past that first period, the second and thirds were actually not too bad for San Jose and made this an semi-interesting game to actually finish out watching compared to some of the earlier terrible losses for the Sharks in the season where it was 10-1, 10-2 and there wasn't even a reason to have the television on anymore. Here tonight, they definitely redeemed themselves at least slightly in the last 40 minutes. But what went wrong in this first period? Well, it was a couple of things. The first that is very important to mention is that this was a second half of a back-to-back, and with an illness to Mackenzie Blackwood, the Sharks had to go with their third-string goaltender, Magnus Krona, who gets his first career NHL start here tonight. And there is a tendency for people when it comes to goaltenders who are playing their first ever game to either consciously or unconsciously heavily defend a goaltender because that position is the most difficult in the NHL. You are the last line of defense, and for these young players, it can be tough to immediately jump into NHL action and actually play super well, especially for a goaltender who even at the AHL level wasn't necessarily looking all that great. And so a lot of people will look at a four goals against first period and say, well, Krona, he just got no help and there was just no effort in front of him. And that is in some ways true, but I do think a good amount of blame does still need to go to Krona. A couple of these goals against were ones he definitely could have had. With league average goaltending, the Sharks probably don't give up 4 goals, maybe closer to 2, perhaps 3 is a bit of a stretch. And I think that maybe allows the Sharks to hang around a bit more in this game because yes, there were mistakes. Yes, the Oilers did dominate the Sharks in this first 20 minutes, but it's not as though they got chance after chance after chance after chance where Krona immediately had to stand on his head to even give the Sharks an opportunity to stay afloat in this game even remotely, and the Sharks deserve to be down 10-0 in the first period. No, the Oilers only had 4 high danger chances in the opening frame, and they end up with 4 goals in those first 20 minutes. So yes, indeed, the Sharks played poorly, but their third string goaltender getting his first start did not look particularly great either. Past the first period, the Sharks pull Krona, they get in Capo Kakinen, and things definitely start to go a lot better. As I mentioned, is this because the Oilers were sitting back due to a 4-goal lead? Perhaps. That definitely could have played a big part in that, but the last 40 minutes, the Sharks were much more competitive and got some chances for themselves. Yes, at the end of the day, they did still get shut out, but they with a post here or there, they almost certainly could have had at least 2 goals in this one to make it a slightly more respectable 5-2 loss. And the only goal that the Oilers would end up scoring past that first period would come from Nugent Hopkins on a quadruple deflection, which was just an incredibly odd and extremely luck-based play that allowed the Oilers to expand their lead to 5 goals. But otherwise, besides a couple of really good shifts here or there from the McDavid line, which is to be expected from a player like Connor McDavid, the last 40 minutes of this game were decently okay for San Jose, though that's more so a consolation in what was otherwise a loss for the team. Of course, they're 7th in a row. Moving on to the players to talk about. Normally, for a loss of this caliber, I probably wouldn't talk about the players. There wouldn't really be much of a reason because there wouldn't be any major positives to mention. But as I said, this was such a strange game where, yes, the first period was quite bad, but then past that, a few players actually did look somewhat good. So let's indeed talk about a few of them. We start off with the first line of Hertl, Eklund, and Zadina. And I will mention that the only Sharks player who I think actually looked good in that opening frame was definitely Tomas Hertl, was setting up multiple chances in those first 20 minutes and looked really, really good on that top line. However, as the game went on, he actually slowed down, oddly enough, considering the rest of the team sped back up. And by the time the third period rolled around, Hertl was more so average compared to his actual good play back in the early parts of this one. And so generally, I would say it averages out to a good game for Tomas Hertl, but it feels as though the way that first period terribly went, where they gave up 4 goals, definitely had an effect on Hertl's effort in this game, as he kind of slowed down as it went on. Compare that to his 2 line mates, at least his 2 line mates early on in the game, Eklund and Zadina, who were both like half decent in the first period, though not entirely great, but then as the game rolled on, both of them definitely improved. What was very strange here tonight when it came to the lineup for the San Jose Sharks is that David Quinn decided to do a few swaps here, and it was Eklund who actually gets dropped to the third line, and Duclair gets bumped up to the first line, with Hoffman taking Duclair's spot on the second line. And this is a bit very strange, actually, because I thought Eklund was playing quite well leading up to this demotion, and even when put onto that third line was essentially the only player on the third line actually doing particularly well. Now, you could theoretically argue that this is a situation in which David Quinn is trying to get the bottom 6 players rolling a bit, because they have been really bad over these last couple of games. So perhaps he takes Eklund, puts him on the third line in hopes that the third line is now going to do better. The logic is technically there, but I mean, from Eklund's point of view, when you get dropped down from a Tomas Hertl line and now your new center is Jack Studnicka, who's like the worst player on the San Jose Sharks at this point, you can't really view it in any way other than a punishment. And especially when you combine that with the fact that he was dropped from the first power play unit down to the second power play unit, it just feels as though this was an extremely undeserved demotion for a player who had otherwise not only been playing quite well over these past few games, but was even one of the better forwards for the San Jose Sharks here tonight against Edmonton. Moving on, however, to the second line, we have Zetterlund, Granlund, and Duclair. And as per usual with this line, they did get their chances. You know, Zetterlund had a couple of really good opportunities, even in the first period. Duclair had a really good look in front where he just could not get his stick on it. But from a defensive standpoint, things did not go particularly well here. It did seem as though David Quinn was aiming to have this line up against the McDavid line for whatever reason, perhaps because he feels as though Mikael Granlund is his best defensive center at this point. I don't know if that's entirely the case. It might be Tomas Hertl still, but that seemed to be what David Quinn was aiming for, at least somewhat, and that didn't really work out super well. What makes this even more odd, the demotion of Eklund and pushing Duclair up to that top line with Hertl and Zadina, is that Duclair was a big reason for why the Oilers managed to score that first goal from McLeod. He was the one who just gets completely walked here for McLeod to be able to take this shot onto Krona. And then when you combine that with the fact that Zetterlund had a very bad effort on the Hyman goal that made it 2-0 Edmonton, this second line, while had their chances, defensively was just not very good. Then we get to the third line of Hoffman, Studnicka, and Cunnin. Now, when it was these 3 players put together, they did literally nothing. There was nothing rolling for these 3 players. However, as I mentioned, Eklund gets dropped to this line, Hoffman gets promoted, and Hoffman looked a lot better on the second line and seemed to have a lot more jump into his game and was one of the better Sharks forwards in the third period of this one. And then, as I mentioned earlier on, once Eklund was dropped to the third line started to generate some chances, but only really off the back of Eklund making some really nice things happen with some strong possession plays. Otherwise, Studnicka and Cunnin were more or less dead weight on this line, as they have been over these past few games. And like I mentioned, it's hard to view a demotion to a line that includes Jack Studnicka and Luke Cunnin as anything other than a punishment here from an Eklund standpoint. So again, not really comprehending the logic from David Quinn. It seems as though just the usual sort of punishing a younger player in favor of others, or sort of in lieu of others. I also want to point out that with the return of Ryan Carpenter here on the fourth line, a player did have to step out, and it was Kevin Labanc. Now, I'm not going to necessarily say Labanc has been having good games, and it's unfair for him to step out, because it hasn't really been the case. Labanc has been quite invisible over these last couple of games for sure, but if I was going to choose a player to drop out of the lineup, I don't see how it could be anyone else besides Studnicka. He essentially gets acquired in a trade, comes into the lineup, plays 6 games, does literally 0, and then somehow manages to maintain a spot even with players returning, especially when you consider the fact that Ryan Carpenter is a centerman returning, and yet you take a winger out. Yes, Cunnin was playing a bit of his an off role. He's not necessarily used to playing in a centerman position. He's much more comfortable on the wing. That is true, but it still feels a bit unnecessarily punitive for Kevin Labanc, who prior to these last couple of games was at least looking relatively decent. And then we get to the fourth line here. It is Barabanov who actually finds himself in this position with both Carpenter and Bailey, and this fourth line didn't really do much. Barabanov did have a couple of moments in a situation where he's playing on the fourth line. He is still relatively skilled, and so he did have a couple of moments against Edmonton's fourth line where he looked decent, but with not so great line mates to work with, no offense to both Carpenter and Bailey, it didn't really amount to anything, and this fourth line was pretty unnoticeable. Then we get to the defensemen here tonight, and like I mentioned early on, it was a strange game for a couple of reasons, and this is yet another one because it would feel as though with the Sharks losing 5-0 that clearly the defense was just terrible all throughout, all 6 players just absolutely doing nothing. But that actually wasn't the case, and it is because of the fact that in particular, let's take a look at Kyle Burroughs for instance. Kyle Burroughs was on the ice for all 5 goals against by the Oilers. Now, this is not me trying to say that Burroughs was at fault for all 5 of these goals. Like I said, Duclair gets walked on the first one. It's bad coverage by Zetterlund on the second one, but it is to say that Burroughs finding himself on the ice for all 5 goals against is certainly not a good thing to be had. When it comes to his defensive partner, Ferraro barely escapes that same -5 fate, as he was on the ice for 4 of the 5 goals, as it was Nikita Okhotyuk who gets the final minus. But that means that Thrun, Ruda, and Kalen Addison were all a perfect even 0 here tonight, and actually played relatively solid defensive games. Addison was separated from Thrun, which I thought was a smart move here by David Quinn, because I don't think Thrun and Addison should ever really be paired together. They have been a couple of times this season, and it's never really worked out. Definitely getting a more veteran Ruda has worked out better for Thrun, because they were a solid enough duo here tonight. Even Thrun having to find a few shifts against Connor McDavid, while not looking amazing, you're never going to look all that great, and even had a couple of good takeaways against number 97. So honestly, a pretty decent game. Kalen Addison, I mentioned in my previous review, had a strong start to that game against the Kings and then just completely fell apart after that one mistake that led to a Kings goal. Here tonight, I actually thought he kept it together through the full 60 minutes and was one of the better defensemen for the San Jose Sharks for sure. And when it comes to Okhotyuk, yes, he was indeed on the ice for one of those goals against, but I actually thought he was, again, for a second straight game, pretty decent. It was just that first pairing was so overwhelmed in their own zone that it ends up looking quite bad from a Sharks perspective. Though it should be mentioned that indeed Ferraro and Burroughs did find themselves on the ice against some really, really tough competition, and when it comes in particular to a player like Kyle Burroughs, it's hard to ask him to play all that well when you're facing off against McDavid, when you're facing off against Draisaitl. It's like asking a 20-year-old car to try and go like 150 miles per hour on the highway. It's just not going to happen. It's not equipped to be able to do that. So while -5 is definitely more embarrassing than it should have been, it's not necessarily a situation where you're like, wow, Burroughs had a really off game. That's just the player he is. And then finally, we have the goaltenders. As I mentioned already with Magnus Krona earlier on, this was a debut game for him, and certainly there were not a lot of favors done for him in front. The defense wasn't great. The forwards were not great either. But at the same time, you give up 4 goals. A couple of them you definitely could have had. The first one for sure. The third one, you could argue, like, oh, he couldn't really get his eyes on that one, but perhaps a better goaltender would have been able to do so. The fourth one was definitely tough, but savable. The second one, he didn't really have much of a chance on. But generally, I think with better goaltending, the Sharks don't find themselves in as much of a hole, and so not exactly the best debut game that Krona was looking for. When it comes to Kakinen, he actually made a few really nice saves in this one. While the Oilers weren't exactly pushing a kind in the last 40 minutes. They did still get their chances here or there, and besides that strange quadruple deflection that Kähkönen didn't really have much of a chance on at all, he made a few really nice saves, and so he sort of kept the Sharks alive, so to speak, but with zero offensive support in front of him, it didn't really end up mattering. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Sunday, New Year's Eve, the final game of 2023 for the San Jose Sharks. They will be taking on the Colorado Avalanche, who they have not played particularly well against thus far this season. We shall see if they can finish the year off on a win. Class dismissed.